Douglas K. McGill. I go by Doug. I was born August 25th, 1944. I'm currently 80 years old, and I'm going to stay there.
I keep telling the story. I swear for 40 years I thought you were in your 40s.
Well,
Kid
thank
you
you very
not.
much. I'll pay you later when we.
Well, Doug, tell us about your life, how you grew up, the early years.
Early years, like I say, I was a twin, and my twin, David, who we were born on the 25th of August, 1944, in Vanceburg. As Bud Boyd used to call it, Gooseburg. I don't know why, but anyway, we were born in Vanceburg, and growing up there to about the early 50s when we moved to Maysville, I don't recall a whole lot happening. I guess when you're young, you don't retain as much, you don't remember. But one thing I do remember about a child in Vanceburg, my older sister was out taking me a walk one day, and some of a neighbor kid had been picking up pop bottles that were crushed. So there were, pieces of glass in a little red wagon. Well, I got too close to it and unfortunately tipped over off of my tricycle into the broken glass.
Oh.
And I can still hear myself screaming as my sister took me to the doctor. And I still have the scar in the middle of my palm of my hand, and when I think about it, it even hurts. But we lived in Vanceburg until about, we moved to Maysville and took up residence on Buckner Street and went to Woodley. I started the second grade at Woodley School. And I can't remember the teacher's name. Most people can. They can say, well, that was Mrs. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so. But anyway, we went schooling. We went to Woodley.
How many schools were there at that time?
Oh, there was probably in town half a dozen, really.
Wow.
Woodley, another school up in the east end of town on, I think, maybe Broadway Street. And then a school down in the west end of town. And I guess Fee School was open then.
And wasn't there, seem to remember a sixth ward that was...
That might have been Sixth Ward.
Behind Seddon Church.
Yes.
Okay.
The fact checkers can knowledge of all that, but and then after school, grade school, we went to junior high school downtown. They had set up a couple of fabricated buildings behind the high school to house the 7th and 8th grade. And then after you finished those two classes, you would go in the back door of the high school, and you were in high school, through the 12th grade. But back then, education, it was fun. You had a lot of fun. There was a lot of activities. I played a little bit of pee-wee basketball. Wasn't really that good on the team, just practice. And now my brother David, he liked to talk more than I do. He was on the Maysville High School debate team. They traveled a little bit, to debate matches here and there. And then after, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but after we graduated in 1962, I like to get out and play baseball and football and a little bit of basketball. And David was like to talk. So he was on the debate team, and then he went to UK on a scholarship, and he was on the UK debate team.
That's a big deal.
Freshman, yeah. And they travel all over the eastern United States. And anyway, he contracted cancer when he was, I guess we were still 18, maybe 19, but he passed away at an early age.
Wow.
And it's just, of course, back then they couldn't. This was in '63, and about all they could do for that type of disease back then was maybe surgery and some radiation. That was about it. So anyway, he didn't live very long. But we back up, and our parents were Lawrence McGill Sr. and Edith McGill, good Lewis County stock. And in 1944, when we were born, my older brother, Lawrence McGill Jr., he was in Europe fighting in the war. So you can see there was quite a spread there. And my mom and dad raised 2 or 3 families, I think. But anyhow, Lawrence McGill Jr., about the early 50s, probably 51, he came to work here at the radio station. Of course, us kids, we would come down with him a lot. Well, the Twilight Lady was on at that time in the afternoons, and because he was employed here, we kind of got a foot in the front door, and we came out once every 2 or 3 weeks, to be on the show to us in this studio here, Dorothy Wood, and another thing that we had in this studio, well, a lot of programming's going on in this studio here.
Hi-Fi Club.
The Hi-Fi Club, yeah. There used to be a plaque in this room, yeah.
Right there.
And they would, on a Saturday, it was sort of a radio bandstand show, I guess you would call it. And that was my first work experience. I was hired here in part-time. When I say part-time, I mean 3 to 5 hours a week. Of course, when you're in school, that was, pretty good change in your pocket.
And how old were you at the time?
At the time, I was a sophomore. Went on the payroll here in 1960. And about that same time, the FCC required a person to have a third-class radio telephone license. So none of us here had them. So we all packed up one day, went to Morehead University to take the test. And all of us passed. And the primary reason for having the third-class license was taking transmitter readings. You had to take certain voltages and currents and antenna measurements, and you had to do that every half hour when you were on duty. And it was kind of to me, one of the most cumbersome things about working back then was the technical end of it. Anyway, and then...
and that was back when you had to turn the AM power down.
Right.
What was up with that?
I don't really. It had something to do with adjacent channels and stations. So you had to cut the power back, I think, to 250 watts, especially at night, and I think that's what it was all about. And 1962, we graduated from Maysville. I might back up a little bit. Our brother Lawrence was program director here. Worked his way up, chief announcer, and then anyway, David passed away in '63. But we sort of we didn't get on the air that much, but what we did, Bill Betts was manager of the radio station. And we went to him and asked him, would you sell us some airtime? And he thought it over. He said, well, yeah, because we were going to go out and get advertisers for the show. So he said, sir, have at it. So I think that went on, that program went on for maybe a year. And we conveyed news about the schools, Maysville and St. Pat and stuff like that. Maybe had a guest in I think maybe it was either 15 minutes or half an hour. That was about it. But that was a lot of fun, and it got us on the air. We got some practice, and it was a lot of fun. And then later, several years later, George Morgan III and yours truly, we had a program, Nightline. It was on, I think, Wednesday. We were talking about that earlier. I think it was Wednesday nights for an hour, maybe. And we did the same thing then. We went out and, of course, and sold airtime, sold commercials on the show. We played the top rock and roll hits. We played every music genre or format that you can think of. The station, the early days was primarily country music. And then in the early 60s, of course, it was rock and roll. And then what they call middle of the road. So anyway, just over the years, the station has had several different music formats. And it was just a lot of fun.
I remember a story that Pat Boone told, that you had the black artists like Chuck Berry would come out with a song, and the studios would have Pat Boone put out, I guess, a homogenized version of it.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of times they would be on the charts at the same time, and Pat would end up topping the chart.
I don't
know how many different ways of wrong that is, but it seems like a lot of wrong.
Well, Pat wasn't one of my favorite entertainers for the simple fact that there was a show, I think in Las Vegas, featuring him and his daughter. She was, pretty popular singer at that time. And he just kind of threw her under the bus, in my opinion. And so I just didn't, from that point on, I didn't care much for Pat.
Well, no, he was an English major. And so when the studio asked him to sing Ain't That a Shame, he says, I've got my degree in English and literature. Can I sing it? Isn't that a shame?
Yeah.
He just did not get it. So what do you want on a Nightline show? What would we expect to hear from you and George?
Well, plenty of music, not a whole lot of gab.
What songs?
I can't recall. Trying to think of some of the artists back then. Elvis, of course. The popular singers and groups, and I especially like doo-wop music and rock and big band. No, don't forget that. Country, the old, what would they say? The old country, not country today.
You're right.
Yeah.
Were you running the board on the air during the British invasion?
Yes. I was a jock.
So what was it like to be on the board when everybody wants to hear the Beatles?
The Beatles, yeah. Didn't take me long to get enough Beatles. But,
I did that with Adele.
But like I say, the old rock, doo-wop, good country, when country was country. And
now, was this the time when AM was still the only station? When did the FM come in?
We put the FM on the air in 68, I believe. And then in 72, the tower blew down up on beside McDonald's. Of course, McDonald's wasn't there then, but had a freak windstorm of some sort, and it just, at that time there was a house not far from the tower.
Right.
There were no businesses per se. And the lady that lived there, she called down here and she said, I think you've got a problem.
Huh.
Said your tower just fell down.
Understatement. Thank you.
Yeah, of course we had a light. alarm down here. If something happened, the FM went off the air, that it would light up, and it was on too. It came on, so we knew something bad had happened. You know, but of course we put in a new transmitter in '72, and I think that's the same one that lasted till I retired. Now, I'm proud to say that when I started here in 1960, the AM transmitter, which was back in the standard warehouse, it was still here the day I retired.
It's about an 800-pound.
Oh my!
I mean,
monster.
It is a monster, but if you look, it is beautiful to look at.
Oh yeah.
Just as a piece of equipment, of course, now the AM transmitter is the size of a microwave oven.
Yeah.
But that beast is just
when I told
beautiful to watch.
Jeff Craycraft I was, in the mood to retire, he said, "Well, will you do me one favor?" I said, "Well, name it." He said, "Will you get and have a new AM transmitter installed?" And I said, "Okay." So I worked on that. Me, Ron Berkeley.
Was Butch in on that?
Butch, yep, absolutely. In fact, Ron Berkeley, he sort of headlined the new grounding system that we had to put in for, because we moved the transmitter, like you said, it's the size of a microwave, and it's up here in the building now. So, but it took, I don't know, 2.5 months maybe to get everything done, but had a lot of good people that were in on it.
Well, let's go back a little bit and talk about the news. Well, first off, let's go engineering, because you got your engineer's license. Tell us how that came about.
Well, I had been working here for, a couple of years, I guess. Well, I read about the broadcast school in Dallas, Elkins Institute. And I signed up for a 12-week broadcasting class. This was in '64, probably. Anyway, I went down there and I was halfway through that 12-week course. And Mr. Betts called me. He said, "Can you switch over to the licensing class to get your first class license?"
How's Dougie doing?
Hey. Said, "Could you do that?" Because the person who was working here, and back then you were required to have a first class engineer on site every day. FC, it was mandatory. And so I said, "Well, I guess I can." Of course, I've been out of school, high school, for a few years, and I said, "Oh my goodness, what am I getting into?" Anyway, I went through 6 weeks of intense. I mean, I never studied that hard in school prior to that. Anyway, I came back with a license, and that was in Dallas, Texas. Came back and was, I guess, an assistant engineer at that point. Then I worked under Joe Gillespie, who was a chief engineer, and he was also a manager of Cablevision. And I forgot to mention, cable started in 1960. I was here when it started. But when Joe retired, I took over as chief engineer among my other duties. And it's a hands-on thing. You have to do it, to really appreciate it and know how things work. But I learned a lot. And I learned a lot from, we had a consulting engineer, Lewis Collins, who is now passed on, and he's from Maysville. His roots are in Maysville. And he started part-time kind of like I did. I forgot to mention, back in the early 60s, the station gave free airtime to local churches. On a daily basis, had morning devotions, which was on the AM station every morning at 8:30, and Sunday worship we would go. We had the equipment to go around and hook up microphones at churches where members of the Mason County Ministerial Association. If they were a member, then you looking for a picture?
Yeah, that's one of them that had to come down too when we dropped the ceiling,
Yeah,
but we still have it.
yeah. But I've been in just about every church in Maysville several times. And we even went to, I didn't have a car at the time, we went to Germantown. I think Germantown Christian maybe, or Methodist, one of the two. And I'd get a taxi cab, load the equipment, we'd take off for Germantown.
Huh.
And after the service over, pack back up, load it up in the taxi, and come back to the station. And one thing about that I remember it well. On the way back from Germantown, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot and killed. We heard that on the radio coming back on CBS, or it might have been Mutual. Because we had the Mutual broadcasting system for years, in the early days up till maybe the mid-'60s. We had the CBS network for several years. And then we had none.
Kentucky News Network.
Kentucky News Network, sure. Yeah, state, regional basis, yeah.
But yeah, you have, well, we've said you've 50 years in the business, and you've had a lot of hats. Aside from general manager, started off as a jock, engineer. Mm-hmm. How did you end up becoming program director and or news director?
I think some people left and they just looked around and said, "Hey, can you do?" I said, "Well, I'll try it," you know. And I really set up the first real news operation. You know, for years and years and years, and people know that we read proofs out of the Ledger in the Daily Independent. But and I'm kind of proud of that. We used to cover on-site news, you know. We were ambulance chasers, I guess, to some degree. But that was a lot of fun, doing the news. It really was.
Now, aside from seeing a lot of growth in Maysville over the years, you also covered a lot of high-profile cases. Now, you ended up getting the nickname Scoop McGill.
Yes.
Tell us, how did that come about? And talk about some of the bigger stories that you covered.
Yeah. I think I got that nickname from Doug Culp. One of the biggest stories that we covered was the murder of Danny Hay, the Maysville police officer. That was in 1979, I believe. Yes. And he was investigating a reported break-in at Clyde Super Value downtown. And it was shot when he was, went in. Another officer was with him, and he was unharmed. And they did take into custody a suspect, and he was convicted, served several years in the penitentiary.
Now, my understanding is that you pretty much camped out at the courthouse every day during that trial.
When the day passed, that I didn't go down to the police department, check in with Doug to see how the case was going, and it seemed like it was 2 or 3 weeks of that, and a very tragic thing that happened. It's just uncalled for, but it happened.
Let's talk about some of the good things. I said you got to see a lot of new businesses and industry come into town, new bridges.
Yeah, the bridges, the Harsher Bridge, and of course they've maintained the bridge downtown to where it's apparently safe to to cross, and a lot of things. The earthquake was another big
1980,
story.
yes.
Yeah, it was 80. I was thinking late 70s, 80. and got to interview quite a few people. One especially was Rosemary Clooney. Of course, Rosemary's brother Nick worked here part-time a few months when he was in high school, St. Patrick. Anyway, I went out to the show. She put on a benefit for senior citizens group to raise some money for them. And I went out and I asked her before the show. I said, I'd love to interview you after the program's over. And she said, oh yeah, I'd love it. So after the program, we went out in the lobby, I think, and taped an interview, and I played it back, I think, maybe on the Breakfast Club one morning.
Matter of fact, that interview is part of the archives for WFTM. I'll see if I can go ahead and insert that here.
Oh, okay.
So everybody can listen.
Okay, great.
Because I know Rosie was talking about what a youngin' you were when you first saw her. And...
Yeah, I told her, I said, when I first saw you in 52, they had the parade in Maysville to honor her for the motion picture that she
Their Stars Are Singing.
And a lot of people to this day still don't realize that she was in the Christmas movie.
Wow.
They think that was her only movie. I've talked to several people and said, oh, I didn't know she made amazing,
Yeah, Red Garters is another one she did.
Red Garters, right. But when I interviewed her, I said, when I was a kid, I was downtown in front of 1 Hour Martinizing. We were like a Boy Scout honor guard or something, as if we could do a lot, bunch of young kids. But anyway, I said, you came by the convertible and you had on this gorgeous brown
A fur coat.
And no, she said it was a gray. Yeah, it's hanging on the wall over there. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. She said, but what do little boys know about fur coats? I said, not a whole lot, I guess. But, she was a sweet lady.
Now, I've had a lot of stuff going on. A lot of people have gone through these doors.
Oh, my goodness.
Bud Boyd always said that small market radio was the springboard. That was where you got your training before you moved on.
Sure.
Talk about some of the people you've worked with.
Oh, my goodness. A lot of people ask me if I work with Nick. I said, no, Nick was there. He worked here in the early 50s, I believe, for not very long. Then he and his mother, they moved to up east someplace. Yeah. But, when I started here, Bud Boyd was here, the mayor of Gobbler's Knob. His sidekick, Jim Lang. Tex McDonald, who Tex ran for city commission, won, ran for mayor, and won. And Tex was the guy that we live in the East End. Tex was the guy that got the road improvements in the East End and sidewalks.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did not know that.
Yep. And he was responsible for that. And he's just a heck of a... And of course, his grandson works at Channel 12. Comes to Maysville and does the veterans program each year.
Bob Herzog.
Bob Herzog. Excuse me, Bob. But Tex was, those were my mentors. I would come up here and just loaf and watch them work. How they did the board, and it was a learning experience. Learned quite a bit from them. Of course, they were a lot older than I was. I was just a youngin'. But
well, I know you trained me, and I had to have been a chore because I was on the phone with you. It seems like every night for the first 6 months.
Every other night. No, you weren't any problem.
But you, me, Danny Weddle,
Danny.
just so many people that have been, and it's interesting how many people who have started here who have gone on to do other things within the community.
Yeah, sure. Another one that I think he had left about the time I started hanging around here was Walt Mayer. Of course, Walt, he wound up sports director, TV in Cincinnati, and covered a lot of. I've heard him talking about covering World Series games in New York, I think. So Walt was quite a gentleman.
Now, I've asked you this millions of times.
And I've declined to answer.
You've declined millions of times, so we'll go for 1,000,001. Whenever we're off the microphone, you have these hilarious stories about things that have gone on at the station. And I said, well, do you mind telling it for the microphone? Nah. And you would clam up. Are there any stories that you would like to regale us with about time at WFTM?
Well, I'm clamming up again.
As expected.
Yeah.
As expected.
I'm trying to think. Of course, there's a lot of funny times, stuff that, that you can't talk about. But nothing comes to mind. Who does that sound like? Nothing comes to mind.
I'll talk about the owners. This is one of the few family-owned stations left in the Commonwealth.
From day one.
From day one,
1948.
Matter of fact, I just turn my head a little to the left and see January 1st, 1948, James M. Finch Jr. and Charles W. Clark, the founders of WFTM. Tell us a little bit about the Finch family.
Well, they've been great people to work for. Absolutely, just pretty much let you do your own thing most of the time, except when you did something wrong or controversial. But yeah, just great people. Mr. Finch's son, James A., wonderful boss. Well, get back to mentioning when I started, Bill Betts hired me. He was a station manager then, and then in 1960, my brother Lawrence, he left and went to Cynthiana to manage the radio at WCYN in Cynthiana. So the Bill Betts pretty much, I think, took over handling cable because his infancy was in 1960.
And Bill was the original station manager
Yes.
for FTM.
Yes. And I lost my train of thought.
Because then you had Roy Redmond.
Yeah, Roy Redmond, about 60 or 61, came up from he was from Maysville originally, but he was living in Clay County, I believe, down in southern Kentucky, kind of in the mining equipment business. That's what I understood anyway. But Roy, he was here till 87.
87.
87. And then I took the reins then, and I guess that's 2010. That's 25 years, isn't it?
That says something about the family and the business that so many people here have spent their entire careers.
Yeah.
And grown up through the ranks. And I look at Danny. I mean, there's just so many people that have just progressed through. Of now, you've got Drew Spangler and Travis Skaggs running things, and
They're doing a great job.
doing a great job. I was fortunate to do it for over a decade, and it's a special place.
Yes.
It really is.
It's hard to put into words, really. You know, and what's radio, the mystery of radio never goes away. You know, I sit at home at night sometimes and I'll find a station that plays the old radio programs. And as a youngster, I remember those well. You know, soap operas on the radio.
Good. Now, I remember seeing some old program logs, and from the early days of the radio, there were programs the airwaves were stuffed to the gills with programs, 5-minute programs, 10-minute. We covered everything from weather to news to sports to the markets. And we were talking the markets. That was back when Maysville was the second largest burley market in the world.
Oh, my goodness. Those days are long gone, of course. But it's just, Maysville was how to describe. But anyway, when the tobacco market was running strong, it was just amazing to look at the number of people that came to town and would eat their meals here, would sell their tobacco and pay their bills, and it was just a kind of a different feel.
Yeah.
Of course, that only lasted 3 months out of the year, 4 months maybe.
But you'd have people, because for people who don't know, WFTM radio is built into the front of the Standard warehouse.
Right.
The house of perfect light.
Right next door to the home warehouse.
Right next to the home warehouse.
Yeah.
And when it was selling time, you would have cars parked 3 deep on Forest Avenue,
Oh, yeah.
which I know wasn't safe.
Mm-hmm.
Did it anyway, but
Tobacco trucks lined up from front of the warehouses down into Wall Park,
wow.
Loaded with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of tobacco.
Now, did you work with Scott True?
Oh, yes, I did. I should have mentioned that. They had the oblong table set here, and Scott came in every day, and at that table, so there, he could see into the control room where the engineer was, and I engineered several of his shows, and but Scott physically got in terrible shape, before he passed. But he was one of the most knowledgeable people, about farms and hogs and cattle and
Then of course,
tobacco, of course.
And of course, he was succeeded by Bill Stewart.
Bill Stewart, who did a fantastic job. Yes. And Scott, when he was doing the program, and Bill Stewart, each tobacco sales day, they go out in the warehouse here in Maysville and record the sale. They maybe talk to some of the farmers and read the tickets off the pile of tobacco, what it sold for, and it was just really that was radio back,
And following the auctioneers as they were doing the sale, walking down the line. It like you said, it's really hard to describe.
And I did it a few times when the farmer and people weren't here to do the show, and I didn't know what I was doing half the time, but I got through it. But it was walk out the warehouse, you smell all that tobacco, and it's just
Yeah.
yeah.
So do you have anything else? Is there anything I've missed? Because to be honest, I'm thinking that this is round 1, and we'll have to set up a time for a round 2 sometime.
Okay.
because there's so much stuff that we've missed.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I've forgotten some people and some things that happened. You know, other big news stories. One of the biggest stories I recall, I got a phone call one night and it said the police are over underneath the bridge. They're pulling a car out of the river. And I said, well, what's going on? They said, well, they think that they were looking for stolen guns. Some guys had knocked off a social club in Mount Sterling or somewhere and had stolen some guns and threw them in the river. So that's what they were looking for. But then they found this great big car. I mean, it was a big car. They pulled that. I stayed down there. They had floodlights and everything. And I think Danny was doing a football game that night. Anyway, they peeled the top of that car off. And you could see a couple bony hands.
Oh,
What
wow.
it was two ladies that the night before disappeared. Well, maybe it was longer than that. Some local night spot had disappeared, and they had been looking for them. Well, apparently, they'd been murdered, put in that car, and the car is shoved into the river. I mean, there was mud, just clear up to the ceiling.
Wow. Well, let's talk about the city, because you talked about the police. The radio station has always had a great relationship with the police, the firemen, our elected officials, and it's just incredible. I don't know how many towns have the type of working relationship that Maysville does between all of its entities.
Yeah, they've always been the police, the sheriff, the fire department, the city officials here have always been very cooperative. Of course, there are times when they can't tell you maybe everything, right on the spot. But yes, they've always been super, and they continue to be today. Thanks, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Doug, thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you and the Finch family and everybody here for inviting me, especially you for inviting me down, and maybe we'll be able to get together again, and I'll jot down the things that I forgot to mention, and that'll make a whole new program.
I definitely see a round two coming. Hopefully we might be able to pry some of those stories out of you.
Okay, we'll try.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.